Hey, true weirdos, at the end of this episode, stick around if you want for a little bonus content and conversation. Death. It's something we don't like to talk about or think about in American culture. So we maybe never stop to consider what giant weirdos we are when it comes to death. We call cemeteries memorial gardens, and then we try hard not to think about what's planted there. We get through our death rituals as best we can, and then we move on. We don't dwell on the specifics, the satin-lined casket, the embalmed remains, the cold, hard hands folded in what's supposed to be a sign of eternal rest. Because if we did focus on that stuff, we'd realize just how weird it all is.
And make out a small beam of light against the mirror.
True weird stuff.
Death in America is big business. How big? Try $23 billion a year in revenue big. That's spread out across roughly 19,000 funeral homes, and about 80% of those remain in private hands. Family businesses, mom and pops, doing the work that was once done by families in the home. The Civil War changed all that. Not because that's when embalming was invented. The ancient Egyptians figured that stuff out a long time ago. The Civil War just created an enormous need for the preservation of the dead, and an industry was born. What did people do before there were morticians and undertakers and funeral parlors and crematoriums? How did they handle the death of a loved one in the days before 911 and ambulances and coroners? Death used to be a private, personal affair, something that was taken care of at home. The custom was for the body of the deceased to be carefully washed, usually by women. Menfolk were tasked with building a coffin and the digging of a grave. Once the body was cleaned and wrapped in a shroud, clothing was far too scarce and valuable to be buried with the deceased. Then it was time to sit vigil. The body was placed in the coffin, which was set up in the home. Relatives would sit with the body of their loved one for 3 days to make certain that they were, in fact, truly dead. Going back to this country's earliest days, we see that Puritan funerals in colonial America were silent affairs. There was no sermon and no eulogies, no hymns. The Puritans considered all of that just ghastly Roman Catholic-style idolatry. And buddy, listen, they hadn't left their homes in England and braved the long, seasick Atlantic crossing only to be stuck doing the very things they'd rebelled against in the first place. No, ma'am. So, silent funerals. And that makes a little more sense when you remember that the Puritans believed in predestination, since there was no amount of wailing or lamenting or even prayer that might help the departed get into heaven at all, much less any quicker. Why make a spectacle of it? Kneeling at the coffin and praying was thought to be both superstitious and utterly useless to the deceased. A funeral was a necessary ritual, but one best kept simple. Ditto for grave markers. The Puritans didn't go in for elaborately carved tombstones or enormous statues of angels. They kept it plain and they kept it modest. But do not for one instant think that the Puritans didn't know how to put on a wake. The night before the burial, family and friends and neighbors would gather in the home of the deceased. The body was typically on display in its coffin, waiting to be viewed. And of course, a sharp eye was kept on that coffin, just in case its occupant awakened. That's where we get the term wake from. Yikes. But this was a real concern in the days when medicine was primitive and certain diseases might cause a person to appear dead when what they actually were was deeply unconscious or maybe even comatose. The Puritans, those joyless scolds, were still human, and the impulse to memorialize their dead, to celebrate that life, was something they gave into, just never at a funeral. Puritan wakes meant feasting and toasting and merriment. Seems like death was the only occasion where merriment was encouraged, and so Puritan wakes were raucous affairs. Maybe that's why rum was often the single biggest funeral expense in 17th century colonial America. The hangovers had to be epic after one of these affairs, and there was no morning after Bloody Mary and a TV nap to look forward to. Now, if the deceased wasn't being interred in a nearby family plot or churchyard, the burial could be a real ordeal. The coffin would be carried to the cemetery by the pallbearers, and if that cemetery was a fair distance away, a second set of pallbearers would relieve the first to finish the job. If the weather was bad, so be it. If the ground was hard and cold as iron, oh well. It was expected that the community would turn out to pay their respects. And the Puritans dearly loved minding each other's business, so your absence would most definitely be noticed and judged harshly. You've heard the expression, funerals are not for the dead, but for the living. Yeah, well, the Puritans pretty much invented that. And over time, as the population of colonial America grew, the pomp and pageantry of funerals grew too. There were special newspapers called mourning broadsheets. This is where the dead were eulogized. It became the custom for attendees at funerals to write their thoughts about the departed and tack those sheets of paper to a designated spot. The papers would be gathered up and published in a broadsheet. Next came funeral tickets, a tradition the Puritans brought with them from England, but one that really didn't catch on in a big way in the New World. Thankfully, here's an example of a real funeral ticket.
You are desired to accompany the corpse of Mrs. Dorothy Wood, late wife of Thomas Wood, gentleman, from his dwelling house in Littleton in the county of Middlesex to the parish church there on Friday, the 17th of November, 1704 at 3 o'clock in the afternoon precisely, and bring this ticket with you.
As squeamish as modern Americans are about death, can you imagine inviting the fam to accompany a corpse anywhere? Then came the custom of giving out funeral gifts. This was the most extravagant of all the displays of public grieving. The traditional funeral gifts in colonial America were gold rings, scarves, and gloves. So it began with the family of the deceased giving the pallbearers and the minister each a pair of new white gloves. Eventually, though, everyone in attendance received a pair of gloves. This random and somewhat baffling tradition tended to be confined to the elites. I mean, a poor family could hardly manage the expense of handing out 140 pairs of gloves every time someone died, and it was mercifully short-lived. Not because the people looked around and said, well, this is weird and expensive, but because the practice was outlawed. In 1761, the Massachusetts Bay Province passed the Act to retrench the extraordinary expense at funerals.
No scarves, gloves, except 6 pair to the bearers and 1 pair to each minister of the church or congregation where any deceased person belongs. Wine, rum, or rings shall be allowed and given at any funeral upon the penalty of £50 to be forfeited by the executor to the will or estate the person interred, to be recovered by action in any of His Majesty's courts of record.
I'll remind you that these are the very same people who passed a law banning the celebration of Christmas. Our Puritan forefathers were most definitely masters at the scratching of what don't itch. A pack of miserable, pinch-faced busybodies whose freakish insistence on pious authoritarianism laid the foundation for so much of the sanctimony and hypocrisy that dogs us to this very day. But where was I? Death and funerals in America. That's right. Okay, so there we were, a people who cared for their dead at home and had silent, sad funerals after a night of slamming tankards full of rum. Then came the Civil War. Whether the uniform was blue or gray, soldiers in that terrible war could agree on one thing. Neither side wanted to be buried on enemy soil, which was a real problem given the limited capabilities at the time for the preservation of dead bodies. Enter the daddy of modern embalming, Dr. Thomas Holmes. He took on the task of embalming fallen Union soldiers for the Army Medical Corps. Other physicians, especially the entrepreneurial types, saw the opportunity to make a few bucks in this game too and seized it. This is extra morbid to imagine, so get ready. Some military surgeons began advertising the service. They'd scoop up an unidentified body left on the battlefield, embalm it, and then pose that dead soldier standing at attention outside their medical tent. As Civil War casualties mounted, those entrepreneurial embalmers upped their prices, which is something they also did when the dead man was an officer of rank. So rampant was this corpse care price gouging that the U.S. government had to step in. On March 15, 1865, the War Department issued General Orders Number 39 concerning embalmers.
Hereafter, no persons will be permitted to embalm or remove the bodies of deceased officers or soldiers unless operating under the special license of the Provost Marshal of the Army. Provost Marshals will restrict disinterment to seasons that can be made without endangering the health of the troops. They will grant license only to such persons as furnish proof of skill and ability as embalmers. They will also establish a scale of prices by which embalmers are to be governed, with such other regulations as will protect the friends and relatives of deceased soldiers.
When they say war is hell, they leave off the part about how some people are just greedy demons. Anywho, if the Civil War jump-started the widespread practice of embalming the dead, then what happened to the body of President Abraham Lincoln might be considered one of this country's first viral marketing campaigns. Lincoln's assassination on April 14, 1865, plunged this nation into deep mourning. So intense was the grief of the American people that the U.S. government made the decision to observe Lincoln's death with a 2-week-long national funeral procession. Traveling by train with a top speed of only 20 miles per hour, Lincoln's body would depart Washington, D.C. for his final resting place in Springfield, Illinois. The body of the slain president would have to be embalmed, of course, if it were to survive that journey reasonably intact. And with thousands of people thronging every stop the funeral train made, the body would also have to remain presentable, which meant that Lincoln's body was embalmed and re-embalmed at nearly every stop. The first handful of stops went well: Baltimore, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and Philadelphia. The city of brotherly love turned out huge crowds. More than 150,000 people waited in 5-hour-long lines to view the body of Abraham Lincoln. And it was looking good, according to the Philadelphia Inquirer. The dead president, according to the paper, sported a, quote, natural, placid, peaceful expression. But alas, this would prove to be unsustainable as the train continued its slow chugging to Illinois. By the time the funeral train departed New York City for Albany just a few days later, the New York Times offered a far less glowing review.
Dark as was the face before, and unearthly it was at 11 o'clock Monday night, nearly 5 shades darker. The dust had gathered upon the features, the lower jaw somewhat dropped, the lips slightly parted, and the teeth visible. It was not a pleasant sight. The condition of the body made it doubtful that additional public viewings could take place.
But take place they did. The press and officials aboard the train gamely tried to put a good spin on that whole gruesome enterprise. The Chicago Tribune tossed out a half-hearted, death has softened the great man's features. Probably. But the then governor of Illinois, Richard Oglesby, who was on the train, became so concerned about the deterioration of Lincoln's body that he sent a telegram to Springfield ordering the scheduled presidential funeral to be moved up at least 2 days. day after day of exposure to the air, to dust, and to the constant motion of the train had done the body of Honest Abe 0 favors. In Columbus, Ohio, as mourners filed past Lincoln's coffin, 14 days after his death, the editor of the paper, The Columbus Crisis, was horrified at what he saw.
A dark, unnatural face whose features were plaintive and pinched and sharp, piteously like death.
Lincoln's widow, Mary Todd, wanted an end to this macabre procession. Her pleas were ignored, and by the time the funeral train rolled into Springfield, after a journey of 1,700 miles, the 16th president of the United States was essentially mummified. It's a grim and gross historical footnote, but what an impression it made on the American people. The modern funeral business was born. Today, death is something we deal with at a distance, a job for professionals. The preparation and preservation of the deceased, an invisible task that happens behind closed doors, a task we don't participate in or even really want to talk about. We've made the very act of dying into an impersonal, technological event that doesn't happen at home. We've made death into an industry. We've sanitized death and separated the end of life completely from the whole process of living. And since we live much longer now than our ancestors and have access to medical interventions that can prolong our lives beyond the wild imaginings of the people of Lincoln's time, our mortality is a can we keep kicking down the road until the end arrives, often under cold, fluorescent lights, accompanied by the beeping and chiming of medical machinery. So, it's just a guess, but it seems unlikely that the ritual of Famadiana will ever catch on here in the United States. Famadiana is practiced by the Malagasy people of the Central Highlands of the island nation of Madagascar. Because fear and revulsion dominate our relationship with death, Famadiana is going to sound weird and terrifying. But to the Malagasy people, it's a tradition that shows respect for the dead and has the power to unite and celebrate families and even heal sometimes broken or strained relationships. So, a traditional Famadiana celebration goes down every 5 to 7 years and starts off feeling kind of like a family reunion. And we're talking a multi-day marathon reunion. Loud dance music pumps from speakers. The food is abundant and the drinks never stop flowing. Guests wear their best clothing, and the family hosting will, if possible, all wear clothing made of the same fabric. The way many American families wear custom t-shirts made just for their family reunions. Wealthy Malagasy families hire bands and professional dancers. Many zebu, that's a breed of cattle that have a distinctive hump like a camel, are slaughtered and roasted. Sometimes gifts are handed out. The cost of hosting a Famadiana can be a real burden on poor families, but it's a burden that no one shies away from, because this ain't just any old party. The word Famadiana means the turning of the bones, and that's a literal description. So what bones exactly will we be turning? Well, on the second day of Famadiana, family crypts are unsealed and the bodies of the ancestors interred within are carefully removed. The bodies of the dead are lifted out of their tomb feet first. Then the old shroud is unwound from the corpse and discarded. Family members stroke the bones with loving hands, telling all the latest news and gossip, but only happy news, only good news, for fear that the deceased might be angry or displeased, and then might be unable to rest. Then the dead are rewrapped in fresh shrouds, ideally made of silk. The name of the deceased is carefully written on the shroud so that this human will always be remembered. A slow ceremonial dance is performed, with the dancers introducing themselves to the dead. Then a dance is performed to the lamba. That's what the silken shroud is called, the fresh shroud, in which the bones will be carefully rewrapped. None of this is rushed. The lamba dance alone can take as long as 2 hours. And if the thought of dancing with the remains of your great-great-grandmother didn't freak you out, maybe the thought of how long this all takes will. Our sense of time is rushed and fragmented. The clock is our taskmaster. But time for the Malagasy is a much gentler and more generous thing. There's no rush to wrap the bones and return them to the grave. No rush to end the party and get back to business. The final ceremonial ritual of Famadiana might blow your mind. As the music plays, the newly rewrapped corpses are raised high and carried aloft so that the dead may once again join the living in the dance. The choreography is slow and measured. 5 steps forward, 5 steps back. The crowd moves in rhythm, surging toward the uplifted dead, and then away, and then forward again. This dance can last anywhere from 20 minutes to 2 hours, but always, always must be completed before sunset. It's traditional then to parade the corpse around the tomb 3 times. Then, to the joyous shouts of all assembled, the shrouded bodies are raised high once, and then twice, and then a 3rd time before being slid back into the tomb head first and placed upside down. Sometimes gifts of tobacco or alcohol or money are placed in the tomb as well. Makes you think of all the supplies loaded into the tombs of the ancient Egyptian pharaohs. After all, we mortals have no idea what the shopping situation is like in the afterlife, right? Also, if you're thinking, well, how sad and morbid and terrible is this? Think again. Famadiana is happy and joyful. No tears allowed. Because death for the Malagasy isn't the end of anything. It's just a stage of life. Famadiana isn't an ancient practice, just one that evolved out of ancient beliefs. It's a practice that's only been documented for maybe the last 400 years. It grew out of the belief that the spirits of the dead are bound to their earthly bodies. And only after the flesh is decomposed and the correct rituals have been observed can the dead join their ancestors in the spiritual world. Put another way, the dead aren't really dead until their mortal bodies are dust. This process takes time, clearly, and requires a big commitment on the part of the living to properly venerate the dead by observing these rituals. More than 85% of the Malagasy people identify as members of the Christian faith. Less than 5% follow strictly traditional beliefs. Famadiana persists even today because loads of Malagasy have simply found a way to blend their indigenous beliefs with their Christian or Muslim faith. And because the Famadiana ritual is more cultural than it is religious. But it's interesting to note that this mashup of Christianity and traditional beliefs doesn't include the Christian version of heaven or hell. Once the Malagasy bodies are dust, their spirits move on to a second life, a life that resembles this life here on Earth. I know there are people who'll hear this and think, well, that is some primitive, superstitious, unsanitary craziness that needs to be stomped out now. There's a word for that kind of judgment, a word for measuring another culture by the rules and regs of your own. That word is ethnocentrism. Humans are fascinating creatures, but damn if we can't seem to help ourselves when it comes to judging up on each other. You think the Malagasy venerating the bodies of their dead and taking them out to dance is weird? Let's imagine what the Malagasy would make of the way we treat our dead. Here, no family member gently washes the body and prepares it for burial or cremation. That's the job of a professional mortician. Out of concern for upsetting the grieving, the mortician typically won't ask you if you'd like your loved one's mouth or eyes closed. That's a hard question for the living to hear. So the mortician will just perform this service as a matter of course. It's called setting the features. See, movies and TV shows have led us to believe that in death, we close our eyes. That is not universally true. That's why morticians have something called an eye cap at their disposal. It's a small plastic half circle that tucks under the eyelid and keeps the eye closed. Bonus, it creates the illusion of a full eye under that lid, because the real eye sinks in death. In order to close the mouth and keep it closed, a suture is used to stitch the inside of the bottom lip to the top lip and the septum. Unlike the Malagasy, whose dead rest on shelves and mostly above-ground tombs with no chemical embalming, we pump our dead full of chemicals. First, the blood is drained from the veins and replaced with a preservative solution, like formalin maybe, a mixture of formaldehyde and water. Fluids are also drained from the body's cavities and replaced with a preservative. This process, though, doesn't deliver super permanent results, by the way. It's meant only to keep the body from discoloring and shriveling. It's meant to create a lifelike enough appearance so that the living may view their loved one in a state that appears restful and serene. You can opt out of this process, of course. Maybe. In the United States, not only is chemical embalming the norm, it's also the law under certain circumstances. If the deceased must be flown home, for example, and you don't have a private plane, you're legally required to embalm the body. In many states, if the lag between death and burial is more than 48 hours, you're legally required to embalm the body. And what would the Malagasy make of the restorative arts of our mortuary industry? Cosmetics meant to restore the illusion of life and health to the flesh of the dead. The products don't look so different from anything for sale at Sephora because they aren't. And the experts who spend their days devoting painstaking attention to the skin and lips and hair of their silent clientele, not much different from the artists using the same skills on the living. Then we place that body, preserved, buffed, and posed in an attitude of peaceful slumber in a fabric-lined box, and invite the grieving to come have a look. The rooms where this takes place seem always to have thick carpets, heavy draperies, a cool antiseptic smell, and an aura of somber reflection. We take our turns paying our respects, murmuring things like, "She looks so peaceful," or "You'd think he was just sleeping." And if you're anything like my ghoulish old aunts, you'll throw in the occasional, "They did a good job. You'd never know the cancer ate her alive." Next, we seal the casket, which, if it's made of steel or metal, might last as long as 50 years or more underground. And if that casket is placed in a concrete grave liner or vault, count on it lasting even longer. What's the difference between the two? It comes down to money, if we're being honest. A grave liner is a concrete box with a concrete lid. A vault is made of reinforced concrete, coat it in asphalt or tar, and paint it to look nice. Vaults also include liners and seals meant to keep the casket dry. But it isn't the law that demands that burials include the use of in-ground liners or vaults. It's the cemeteries. Sealing the casket in a grave liner or vault helps prevent the ground above the casket from sinking in. Saves the cemetery a load of maintenance, though that's not how they sell it. No one wants to think of their loved one gently steeping in groundwater, and that concrete shell offers a sliver of comfort to the grieving, a little bit of added protection from your own imagination as much as anything else. How long does it take an embalmed body in a metal casket in a concrete box buried underground to decompose? Great question. Turns out there are a lot of factors at play. Embalming buys you anywhere from 5 to 10 years. Longer if the deceased had received antibiotics or chemotherapy prior to death. Both kill off bacteria, and it's bacteria that helps break down a body. Not all embalming jobs are created equal. some are better than others. Here's a historical fact you may be unaware of. Civil rights leader Medgar Evers was murdered and buried in 1963. In 1991, his body was exhumed as evidence in a murder trial. After 28 years in the grave, Evers' body was so incredibly well preserved that his son was permitted to view it. That's good work on the part of the embalmer, by our standards. Another factor, how acidic is the soil in which the casket is buried? The more acidic the soil, the faster the casket erodes, exposing the body within to insect activity and the elements. Is all this just freaking you out and giving you the creeps, and it's just horrible, and why do we even have to think about any of this, and now you're sorry you even know it, and please, does anybody have a Xanax? Well, can you imagine what the Malagasy people would make of our funeral practices? We transform our dead into waxen effigies, seal them up in as close to an impermeable box as we can find. We sink that box 6 feet into the earth, and then we walk away. Sure, we visit the spot, maybe. Or we take that waxen effigy and we slide it into a locked drawer in a building that resembles a palace. At least it would seem so to the Malagasy. Or we take our dead, burn them to ash, and seal those ashes in a jar. Or maybe scatter them in the sea or in the garden. For the Malagasy, the way we treat our dead would seem unspeakably strange and cruel. Why do we insist on delaying decomposition, knowing that doing so delays our ancestors' chance to enter the spirit world? Why do we pump our dead full of poisons and paint them like dolls, only to hide them away forever, deep underground? Why do we treat our dead like they no longer have any place in the world of the living? Whether it's hoisting the body of your grandfather aloft and ceremoniously dancing with his bones, or standing beside his open coffin, realizing he's no longer in the body before you. Death is a mystery that humans will never solve. If the Malagasy Famadiana seems weird and superstitious, how do you think putting lipstick on dead grandma's sewed-shut mouth comes off? Maybe a little weird and a little superstitious? We're all just people. None of us, as the saying goes, are going to make it out alive. You opt for burial or cremation. The Malagasy throw a party and turn the bones. They are no more primitive or strange or bizarre or weird than you are. Well, listen. Those Civil War surgeons who scooped up dead soldiers and embalmed them, posed them standing at full attention, full salute, propped those poor dead men up just outside their tents to attract business. Like, what in all the Saw movie creepiness was that? Those dudes are the only real weirdos in this tale. Next time on True Weird Stuff, we are going to pay a visit to one of the most haunted houses in the entire world, and you're never going to guess who got there before us. Well, that would be the devil himself on the next True Weird Stuff.
Okay.
Hey, podcast living up to its name this week, am I right?
Sorry. I just have to say, there were so many points along the line. I wanted to stop you when you were doing this because I kept on going, I'm sorry, what did you just say?
You were like, nuh-uh.
It's kind of funny. And I don't know that I'm facing death. I guess we're all facing death in some way, but I don't know that I'm facing it anytime soon. It's not something that I fear. And the idea that something funny would happen to my corpse, like my corpse is stuck in an elevator with two nurses and it's pushing out gas or something and they're giggling. That to me would be the greatest thing in the world. So there's a weirdness about all this, but at the same time, I have a very weird, dark sense of humor about it as well.
I do too. And I think, so let me just be clear. Like, I have the same paralyzing, like, oh, I don't want to die as anybody does. And I believe that there's more than just this life, right? Like, I believe we go beyond this physical realm. I still don't want to die. Even though I believe in reincarnation, this version of myself has stuff to do here. I have kids and people I love, right? I don't want to die. But when you grow up in an ethnic family that treats funerals and viewings as prime social occasions, you have a different outlook on death. So, my people are Italian American, and they firmly believe that children should be taken to funerals. Like, it was weird for me when I grew up and met people that as young adults were going to their first funeral. Like, wait, but there's really good cake after a funeral. Like, how have you never been to a funeral? Here is how deeply morbid and macabre my people are. They had a favorite funeral home on Broad Street in South Philly. It's probably still there, Monty's. My grandmother would be like, oh, he does such a good job. And then there was another funeral home in that section of South Philadelphia, which is just like, it was for the longest time an Italian American enclave, but of course it's so much more diverse now. It's an incredible melting pot. But there's a section of Broad Street down near where the Phillies play, the stadium.
Right.
It's just one funeral home after another. It's Monty's and Leonetti's and so on and so on. My grandmother and my aunts would talk such smack about opposing funeral homes. Sam Monty knows what to do with the dead. That was a huge compliment. But you remember when they put Grace at Leonetti's and she looked like a circus clown, this kind of thing, right? So, I mean, I've been going to funerals and viewings for a very, very, very long time. And as a result, I would never in a million years consent to any of that. Like, cremate me and do whatever. Do not waxen me up, paint me like a harlot and put me in a box. Absolutely not. How about you?
I'm the same way. By the way, Monty's is still there.
It's because he does such a good job. Such a good job.
Yeah, I it's funny when you were talking about this, I can remember going and seeing my cousin's funeral. And my cousin was 6'6". He wasn't just tall, he was big, and he was a great athlete, and he was very strong, and he died from cancer. And I remember going to the funeral home, and they had a viewing, and I remember looking at him and thinking to myself, this isn't him. Do you know what I mean? I would rather not see this because I want to remember him the way he was. The same was true when my grandmother, my father's mother, and that was in South Jersey. They did the same thing. There was no question as to whether we're going to. And I don't know. I think that there were religious reasons. I think at one time the Catholic Church was down on cremation. I don't know that that's the case now. I don't know what the ruling is on that now. But I, like you, would rather be cremated, have my ashes spread somewhere on a mountain, someplace I went hiking, or at the sea, or something of that nature. But I will tell you that one of the things that we've talked about before is sometimes if you go to – now, I went to funerals as a kid. I can remember one of my cousins died. He got hit by a vehicle and died. And I remember it's a shame they couldn't have an open casket because he was so badly mutilated was the conversation from one of my aunts. I remember that.
Oh, my God. Can we please? So, Max, my pop-up was killed in a plane crash. So my pop-up was a chief in the United States Navy, and he was just the greatest. He went to Temple, where I got my bachelor's degree, and after he retired from active Navy duty, he worked with the CIA in Iran during the Shah's regime before the Shah was toppled by the Ayatollah. I mean, my grandfather had quite a life, and he was a private pilot when I was a little girl, I used to be his co-pilot. He would take me up in his plane, and he would buzz my grandmother's house, and she would run outside and wave a kitchen towel. And it was just the most wonderful adventure. Well, he flew to Wyoming and spent about 6 months with us out there. And when he took off to fly back home, there had been a repair done to the wing of his airplane. And when he hit altitude over Kemmer, Wyoming, the rivets tore out and his plane crashed to the ground and he was killed. And so, of course, the body was flown back east. He was only 56 years old. Like, he had his whole retirement in front of him. It was devastating. Body was flown back east, and we all piled into the Chevy Malibu and made the trip. And I can remember so vividly, like it happened yesterday, listening in to the adults talk about how they couldn't have an open casket viewing, and this has haunted me. And this is why it's not good that we don't talk about death and we're so weird about it, because our inability to talk about it only feeds the fear, right?
Mm-hmm.
His body was so broken that they couldn't put his naval uniform on him. They just draped it atop the remains. And he had a full military funeral, 21 gun salute, the works. It was incredibly moving. But as a child, this man who had been so vibrantly, delightfully, wonderfully alive, now I'm picturing, I don't even know what underneath his uniform. And I don't know what the answer to that would be, except like for the Malagasy people, they would have been just as devastated by that loss as we were, but we would have taken him out 5 years later and danced with him. You know what I mean? We wouldn't have sent his grandchildren into the future with a lingering horror of what had happened to his body.
When you were talking about that, the only thing that I could think was their memory lives on, and there's something about that that's kind of nice, that somebody would still care for that memory to live on, The other thing that I have never witnessed, but I think you have, is at a funeral, now this is not at the funeral home, this is at the cemetery, the grave dive.
Oh, yeah.
Now, you have witnessed this, correct?
Several times. My people are as dramatic as an opera. Okay. Well, the older generations, I think my generation and beyond, like, nobody cares. But I've been to several funerals where the grieving widow or the grieving mother went into the grave after the coffin and had to be pulled out and resuscitated. And oh my gosh, and it's traumatic. That is a traumatic experience of death. Very different from dancing and singing and feasting.
Now, I will remind you that you did promise that if I died before you, that you would do the grave dive for me, just so people would say, wow, what did he have going on?
I hope you're not going to make me jump into the crematorium after you.
Sherry, the Abraham Lincoln story is, I have never heard that, and I'm surprised that I didn't know it, because it's the kind of oddball thing I would know. That is...
You didn't know that?
No, I didn't know that. That is so disturbing. I don't know where to begin for one of the most honorable men this country has ever produced, and this is how it ends for him.
Something I say often on this podcast in these episodes is we do not know our own history. We are not taught our own history. We're taught timelines and dates and battles. And we're required to memorize things that nowadays, especially with the internet, you just don't need to memorize unless you're doing a party trick, right?
Right.
Like, you really don't need to have all the presidents memorized. It's kind of cool if you do, no slam, but it's an unnecessary use of classroom time. We don't learn our own history. The fact that it took the Civil War, which comes up a lot on this show, sometimes I think that if it wasn't for the ancient Egyptians, those bastard Puritans in the Civil War, we wouldn't even be doing True Weird stuff, right? Does it trip you out how frequently those three entities are woven into content?
The Civil War especially was a real turning point in this country because it was a war kind of unlike any up until that time, just because of just lots of things that came along during that time. That was the first one where there was some technology involved with it that was really kind of different too, and it really was a turning point for lots of reasons in this country.
The Civil War birthed the modern funeral industry, and Abraham Lincoln showed the whole nation that embalming was kind of a cool thing to do. So the magnitude, we had 6 million dead in the United States Civil War. 6 million dead.
It is so mind-boggling to think that many people lost their lives in that war. It's just,
I saw some jack off on Twitter not too long ago saying that another civil war is necessary because the only way to correct this country is in bloodshed. And I'm like, sir, you are what we call an asshole. Because you don't understand, you don't know your history. 6 million dead. Without the Civil War, I don't know what American death rituals and the American funeral traditions would look like.
You realize that all the other wars combined that we have fought as a country don't add up to the number of people who died in the Civil War. Yes, it was brother against brother. Yes, it was within the country. So I understand that. But that is an astonishing figure when you think about it. The other thing that happened during that time, because we had photography, and I know we've talked about this on the Bob and Sherry show, and that is the fact that people used to take pictures with the corpses, and then afterwards the photographer would draw the eyes of the deceased in to try to make them look alive.
And God, we're so weird.
And what they would do is, if they didn't sit them in a chair, they would put their corpse, which I think is a funny word all by itself. They would put their corpse up on a rack so they could stand with the other family members. I mean, and this was because before this, there wasn't any photography. This became sort of standard procedure where everybody kind of looked at each other and went, yeah, I guess this is what we're supposed to do. And so they did that for many years.
And the thing about like everything that you're saying, everything we've talked about in this episode, we act like, well, of course, that's just what you do. And then you look at what other cultures do and you go, ooh, savages. Like, sit down. Like, we're freaks too. We're all freaks when it comes to this stuff. Like, we're all freaky. I do kind of love it's changing. It's changing because death is big business and it's recession-proof business. And you have no worry that it's going to go out of style, right? The fact that the majority of funeral homes in this country are still mom and pop privately held businesses, I think is really heartening. Of course, that's changing. You know, corporations are coming in.
So what happens is corporations come in, but they keep the mom and pop name, so you still think that it's owned by locals.
I mean, it is. Yeah, it is a big, big business. And cemeteries. Now, America does not have the largest cemetery in the world. The largest cemetery, do you know where the largest cemetery in the world is? It's in Iran, and there are 6 million graves.
Oh, my.
Yeah, like, whoa. It's like unthinkable what happens when a cemetery gets full, because they do. They do a number of different things when cemeteries get full. They open up a new section. Sometimes they'll remove old coffins and remains and dispose of them. Like, there have been some shady ass things.
Oh, around the funeral business? Does it seem like that there is some incredibly gruesome, selfish behavior by somebody involving this? About every 2-3 years you hear that is so bizarre and so gross what they've done.
No, you're not wrong. And in fact, this time last year on True Weird Stuff, we did a story about the mother-daughter grave robbers. Do you remember?
Right. Oh, yeah.
Mommy and Me Body Snatchers. It was March 3rd, 2023, episode 8. Oh, and by the way, y'all, this is episode 57 of True Weird Stuff. Thank you for hanging with us. I don't know how we got to 57 episodes. I feel like we come skinning into home plate on fire most weeks.
Every week, that's what it feels like. Yeah.
Oh, my gosh. So, yeah, we did a whole episode on these two women that were involved in the illegal sale of body parts. They were, instead of giving grieving families the ashes of their lost loved ones, they were giving them like urns filled with cement dust. I mean, just the most unscrupulous and horrible behavior that you can imagine. But death, like everything else in human life, is cultural. So in our culture, it's unthinkable that every 5 to 7 years we would take our grandparents and parents out of their graves and dance with them. It's absolutely unthinkable.
Yeah, you wouldn't do that, no.
And yet, put yourself in the shoes of one of the Malagasy families in Madagascar, and they're going, wait. So you loaded grandma with chemicals and put lipstick on her and put her in a box and then buried her in the ground, and you're never going to venerate her? You people are savages. Like, you can, it's so easy to flip it and see, is it not?
It
like
is.
How very, very strange.
It is, but if you grow up, but whatever you grow up is your normal. And so you just sort of accept certain things along the way. And then it's only as an adult you could turn around and go, this was a little weird. I suspect, and I don't know if I'm right here, but I suspect the viewing of bodies is not done nearly as much as it was 30, 40, 50 years ago.
I'm with you on that. I think that we are experiencing a big cultural shift. And I think a lot of that has to do with the more mainstream acceptance of cremation. Like, it's, of course, and don't ask me how I managed to get to this conversation, but I often will ask people, so what do you think? Like, what's your big plan, cremation or burial? So I had a chiropractor's appointment, 2 weeks ago, and I'm talking to Dr. Tim, and he said, so you had a big day today? And I was like, oh, I just finished writing a True Weird Stuff episode about the death rituals of the Malagasy people of Madagascar. Are you thinking you want to be buried or cremated? When I tell you the man went pale and took a step back, he was like, I'm going to go with cremation.
The only thing that being buried in a cemetery, I could leave like a snappy epitaph, like I finally have depth. And then I could be the funny gravestone. People go, yeah, I know we're seeing it is grandma's day. Look at this one over here. Look at this one over here. I finally have depth.
I go when I go up north to visit my brother and his family, I go visit my grandmother's grave. So my grandmother, my pop-up who died in the plane crash. So my grandma black hair who raised me, and my pop-up and my aunt, their only daughter, they're buried side by side in this enormous memorial garden. And their grave is kind of hard to find because the rules of this cemetery are you can't have any raised headstones. They're just those stones that are, embedded in the ground. The grave is always a little bit hard to find. And eventually I find it and I go sit there. And it's like, I know you're not here, but I feel that it's wrong to neglect the grave. But if we're being honest, it's probably been 3 years since my last visit there. We do neglect the graves. We do.
It's funny we're talking about this, and I haven't done anything on social media. I haven't talked about it on the regular show or anything else, but both of my parents passed away last year within about 7 months of each other. And they are buried in my father was in the Navy during World War II, so they are buried in a veteran cemetery, but they are buried on top of one another.
So your mom is crushing him for all eternity. It's kind of beautiful.
No, it's the other way around. Because she passed first, they buried her first, and my father's being buried on top. And my nephew comes over and he goes, yeah. He said, he's being buried on top. He said, I'm sure she's in eternity, pissed off about this somewhere.
Don't you know?
So
Get off me, Frank.
But please don't.
I know.
But the thing is, I'm joking about it. Of course, I had the grief and everything else connected with their passing. So I'm not being cavalier about it. I'm not but I think that all of these situations, when I think about going to funerals, there's whispered tones, and then people have humorous things that they say because you can't stay in that sense of grief constantly. You know what I mean?
You can't.
You just can't.
And I can so because my family is so freaky, creepy, and so into, the whole like, oh, good, there's going to be a viewing and then we're going to have a buffet. Like they're so into it that when my grandmom died, and she was my world, my God, she was my everything. When she died, it was just so devastating. And she had told me that she wanted to be buried in this one specific peach-colored gown that she'd worn to a wedding. So it was like floor length, and it had some crystal embellishments. And I found it in her closet, and it was so moth-eaten that we couldn't do it. So now we've got to find something else to bury my grandmother in. And we're on our way to the funeral home to pick out a casket. And I want to be really careful that I don't create the impression that I think that the funeral business is predatory, because some of the kindest people that I've ever spent time with in my life work in the funeral industry. But, capitalism, they do try to upsell you. And we all know that's true, right? We can say that without being dicks. They do try to upsell you. And my grandmother had very specific wishes for what she wanted. And so we were kind of resistant to the upselling because we were trying to honor her wishes. But on the way to the casket showroom to pick out my grandmother's coffin, we're on the Black Horse Pike in New Jersey near Runnymede. And there's a bridal store having a sidewalk sale. And my sister-in-law said, pull in. And so we pull in. And there in the parking lot of this bridal store in Runnymede, New Jersey, is a rack of gowns. And one of them is that gown. The peach gown that was too moth-eaten to bury her in. We got it for like $24 in a parking lot sidewalk sale. And on our way to the coffin thing. So we were crying, we were laughing, and we were like, Grandmom is with us because she loved a bargain so much, right? So we were all like, through our tears, there was so much laughter and joy because A, we got a bargain, and B, we were going to be able to bury her in the dress that she wanted to be buried in. So we get the coffin and we give the undertaker, who was just the kindest soul, the dress and, blah, blah, blah. We have the viewing and everybody comes and says that, oh, Sherry, she looks like she's sleeping. No, she doesn't. She looks like Weird Al Yankovic. She does not look like she's sleeping. Okay. But people need to comfort you, and you need to accept comfort, right?
Right.
So now the next day is the funeral. We're going to have a big Catholic mass followed by a graveside service. We're drawing straws on who's going to jump into the grave. And the funeral director invites the family for a private goodbye before they seal the coffin. We sent my grandmother into the afterlife like an Egyptian pharaoh. In her coffin, we stuffed a carton of Marigold 100s, one of those giant Hershey bars, a Whitman sampler, a Soap Opera Digest magazine, a copy of the National Enquirer. I mean, pictures of all of us, pictures of her Schnauzer Heinz, her wedding picture. We sent her sailing into the next world, loaded for bear. And there are people that when I've told them that, they've been horrified. But when it comes to death, it's what makes sense in your worldview and what gives you comfort.
Right.
And that's going to be different, I think, not just for every culture, but it's even going to be different in different religions, different ethnic groups, different geographical regions. It's just going to be different.
Sure. This is why you're my people. I thought that was great. There was no part of me that was horrified by that. I just think that that's absolutely perfect. It really is.
Max, thank you. Because when I look back on that, Here's what I remember about my grandmother's death: the devastation of losing her, but then the wild mixture of laughter and tears as we as a family navigated those final decisions and that final goodbye. And I was one of the people who spoke at her funeral and eulogized her. And I will say, and this is why I'm not a fan of burials. I mean, you do you. Here's why I'm not a fan of burials. I could not leave the cemetery after her funeral because I couldn't bear to drive away and leave her behind, even though I knew she wasn't there. Right?
Yeah.
I think had we cremated her, which she was a pre-Vatican II Catholic and the Virgin Mary's best friend, she wouldn't consent to cremation. Had we cremated her, we wouldn't have left her behind. We would have taken her home. And so I think it was that turned me fully and completely between my pup and they couldn't put his uniform on, what was left of him, and leaving my grandmother alone in that cemetery. I became a person who wants cremation. How about you? Do you know when you made that shift?
I don't know. At some point along the line, I would see people that, the remains were, were scattered in places. And there was something that was kind of fitting that their remains became a permanent part of something that meant something to them rather than some cemetery somewhere. You know what I mean? That there was something physical that you were actually a part of the sea or part of a mountaintop or part of a trail or something like that.
When my best friend died, she wanted to be cremated. She had the same disease that Bruce Willis has, and she was diagnosed really young, and she died really young. It was just freaking awful. Eventually, when her children were older in their 20s, they took her ashes. They left part of her in Alaska, which was a place she and I had gone together on an adventure, and she loved it. They took part of her to the beach, and they took part of her to the North Carolina mountains where she loved to hike. And when I think about her in all of those places. I don't think about her in a grave, And so that's the point of death rituals. It's because it is as even the Puritans, oh my God, do I hate the Puritans, but even the Puritans understood this is for the living. This is not for the dead.
Right.
So and now the Puritans thought it wasn't for the dead because those bastards just didn't think there was any point in praying for somebody. They were born destined for hell. So what was the use? Oh my God, they are so insane, the Puritans. But they did recognize that the funeral rituals were a necessary thing for the living. And so what gives the living comfort, right? In your case, and in my case, it's the idea that this person that you loved is part of the ocean now. Mm-hmm. In the case of the Malagasy people, it's the knowledge that soon, in some set amount of time, we'll see them again and we'll stroke their bones and tell them all the good news and dance and celebrate who they once were and what they meant to this family and this community. That's kind of beautiful,
It is.
And I want to tell you one more Lynch family death story because they're all just so good. Oh,
please.
This is going to make you think of Little House on the Prairie. This is like, what? So my stepfather, who I adored, died of congestive heart failure and lung disease, pulmonary disease. And he had a very traditional funeral. He was embalmed and we had an open casket viewing. And I have never felt more strongly that whatever was in that box was not my stepdad than I felt. It was so not him that it was ridiculous. They could have put a talking horse in that box for as much as it had to do with Ted. And he wanted to be buried in Star Valley, which is in Wyoming. And it was so cold. Winter in Wyoming is real. And it was so cold that the custom there is during the winter months, you can have a funeral, but you can't have a burial. Mm. So the bodies are stored in refrigerated warehouses until spring when you can break the soil and open a grave. And when I found out that Ted was going to be stored until perhaps sometime after Mother's Day, I was like, what in the Donner Party pioneer tarnation is this? Like, what do you mean we can't have his funeral? They were like, well, just can't do it. That's just how we roll here. Max, in this point in human history, does that not shock you? I mean, I guess I thought they had some sort of heat. I don't know. I don't know what I thought. You're grieving. You're out of your mind.
Yeah.
But I didn't, for months after he died, and he had made me promise, like years before he died, that I would speak at his funeral. And oh my God, it was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. But for months after his death, I was so uneasy because we weren't finished with the ritual of letting him go. And all of that was reawakened for me during COVID when people couldn't have funerals, remember?
Right. So when my father passed, it was in November of 2023. And so I got in touch with my sister and I said, so I'm trying to make plans to know when to come up, for the funeral and that sort of thing. And what happened was they were busy at the funeral home. I guess business was good. And so here's my dad. Even in death, he has to wait in line. You know what I mean? And then they had all this Veterans Day stuff. So he had to wait through all that. So it was many weeks, maybe 4 weeks. Yeah, it was probably about 4 weeks before we actually got to the funeral and the burial.
Which, tell me that didn't weigh on you.
It felt weird. It felt very weird because I guess the feeling that I had was he's my dad. He should be in the front of the line. Here's my dad who was a veteran. He should be in front of the line. He I could go on for an entire podcast and I've thought about it, just talking about him and what he's done in his life. It just felt weird to me that there was something that was very impersonal about that, because the most important person in my life should be the most important person in yours. You know what I mean? It's like
exactly.
You said something when your grandmother passed, and I've never forgotten it. You were in line at the funeral, and everybody else outside of there was going about their business of the day. And here you were in this moment of incredible grief over this woman who loved you so much, and you loved so much. And it was as if for all these other people, they had no idea what was happening with that.
I couldn't fathom how life could just go on. My grandmother died in June, in mid-June, and it was her funeral was the most beautiful blue sky, green grass summer day you could imagine. And my God, we are morbid people. Like, my people would do very well with the Malagasy, okay? Because we left the church and we asked the funeral director if the funeral procession could drive by my grandmom's house one last time. And so we did. And I can't even imagine what the neighbors made of this, because that's not a typical thing you see coming down your suburban street. No. But the funeral director was so, like I said, I hate when people talk about that industry being predatory, because the industry, capital I, may be predatory, but the people who work with the grieving, I've just never encountered anyone but angels walking this earth, any Hoosers. So, we go by and they had to drag me. They had to sedate me to get away from her, to take me out of the room in the hospital, away from her body. I mean, they had to doctor had to come in and literally sedate me so they could get me off of her body, her dead body. Then they had to drag me kicking and screaming out of the cemetery. And I went back to her house, and I remember sitting on the front steps of her house and watching the neighbors go about their business. And like the ice cream truck came, down the street playing that stupid song. And I was like, it's like that W.H. Auden poem, that was in Four Weddings and a Funeral. You know what I'm talking? I don't have it memorized.
I do know which one you're talking about.
You.
Yeah.
Give the dog a juicy bone, stop the clocks. I'm like, how can y'all, like, there's been a hole blown inside us you could drive a car through. Like, how do you just keep going? And I think part of the reason I'm so drawn to the turning the bones, the Famadiana ritual, is, and maybe it's magical thinking, their dead aren't really dead to them.
Mm-hmm.
They're just not really gone. And Max, you know, because you've lived it very recently, that hollow feeling of believing that this person that you loved is gone.
Yeah. But
is that a human thing? Is that a cultural thing? Because the Malagasy don't believe that.
I suppose, I think there are things that whether you have religious culture or the Malagasys with what they do, there are certain things that you believe in. I think there's certain things you are raised to believe, but I always think that there is a bit of questioning inside when you say that. We've been told, you go to religious and you say that you've been told there's heaven or hell, and that's it, unless you're Catholic, and then there's purgatory and limbo and whatever else there is, the different levels of heaven and the different levels of purgatory and all that other stuff that's really confusing, My father, I visited with him. Well, it was in August of last year. And, of course, my mother had passed at this point, and we're sitting in his room and we're talking. And my father was pretty with it. I mean, he was a little in and out at times. But what he said to me, he says, "Where do you think we go when we die?" Boy, you would think that a lifelong Catholic who was very devoted would have an answer for that. But here he was with a questioning at this point in his life. And I said, "I don't know, Dad." I said, "I guess that's why they call it faith, because I don't know. And none of us really know."
We don't.
But I'm not telling myself this. I just have this innate feeling inside that what ends up happening is we do go on to something else, that we are indeed eternal, that it's not just lights out, that's it. I don't believe that. The other thing that was very weird for him, and if you will indulge me for saying this, my parents lived to be 101 and 102. They outlived everybody. So when we went to the funeral, my father's funeral, there really weren't very many people there because they outlived everybody. And the only thought that I had as I was sitting there in that church was how many times you could fill this very large church over and over again with the people who he touched in his life. And I think when you live your life in that way and you have an energy that you give to people, that is the way that we are eternal on this plane. And that continues being given. That person gives it to the next person that gives it to that person. And that's how we ripple through lives.
Totally agree. And it makes me think of one of my favorite books of all time, which is A Brief History of the Dead. The idea that you're never really dead until the last living person has lost a memory of you. And I think about, obviously there are certain famous historical figures. Genghis Khan, not a good guy, but certainly remembered here on Earth, right?
I was hoping when I said that, I was hoping this would be in a positive way, not the Genghis Khan way.
Well, but then I think about my grandmother, who was just this little lady whose parents came to this country, did not even speak English. She married her high school sweetheart. She was a foster mom. She was a military wife. She raised her children's children. She never had an education. A lot of the dreams she had did not come true. But she's immortal in a lot of ways, because I've told so many stories about her that I'll see sometimes, like on one of the social media sites, somebody will make a reference to Grandma Black Hair. That was her nickname.
Right.
As children, we were very simple-minded. We had Grandma Black Hair and we had Grandma White Hair. And they got their names based on, guess it, the color of their hair. But I'll see like someone who never met my grandma say like, "Oh, that reminds me of a Grandma Black Hair story." And I smile to myself and I think, oh, there's still a person on this earth who holds your memory. And as long as someone here holds your memory, you're never truly, truly gone. So I apologize if this episode really sent you screaming into the night, but we're all facing this. We're all facing it. And I think that when you have a paralyzing fear of death, it can really drain some of the sweetness out of life. And maybe if we could talk a little bit more openly and maybe even laugh in a dark, twisted way, we could get some of that sweetness back. And I had no idea you did not know about the Abraham Lincoln. I restrained myself from some of the descriptions I could have put in this episode about Abraham Lincoln.
But you know me, Sherry. I want the weird stuff. So.
When I tell you that it was like by the time they got his body to Illinois for his funeral, he looked like a mummified, nightmarish creature, dark skin, sunken features. There was a smell because, of course, this was 1865 and all of this technology was pretty new. And that was Abraham freaking Lincoln, the great emancipator. So if we can turn Abraham Lincoln into a carny sideshow, then you need to accept that death is coming for you and hope for one shred more of dignity than the 16th president of the United States of America received. And I guess that about wraps us up for this episode. True Weird Stuff. Really do thank you for listening. And next week, a haunted house story.
Ooh.
A true haunted house story. The place still stands. And at the end of the episode, you'll find out how you can visit it. Maybe spend a vacation there. But remember, this ain't just any old ghost. This is the devil himself. We'll see you next time on True Weird Stuff.
And if you listen to us on Apple Podcast, hit the plus button in the top right corner, and now it helps an independent podcast like ours to get discovered. And we really appreciate it if you subscribe, rate, and review True Weird Stuff.
Hit our website, trueweirdstuff.com, for show notes and photos and videos when we have it, and bonus content. Everything True Weird is waiting for you at trueweirdstuff.com.
And follow True Weird Stuff on Instagram and Twitter.
True Weird Stuff is a Now Media production. Our executive producer is Anthony Garcia. The show is written and hosted by me, Sherry Lynch, along with my deeply weird director, Max Sweeten. Our equally odd producer is Carrie Bowser. Additional production by the mysterious Stephen Call. Our digital witch and social media cult leader is Heather Furr. Original graphics by Kevin Nash. Original artworks by Olivia Axlin. True Weird original music composed and performed by Jack Griffin and Zane Nash. Copyright 2024 Now Media. All rights reserved. All wrongs remembered.